Alrighty, so hello. My name is Bruce Becker and I'm the president of FoodQuest TQ. We are a small risk management company that's located in Frederick, Maryland, and we want to thank each and every one of you for being here. This is our third iteration of food fraud webinars. So let me see here. Okay, so this morning we are going to present the third in a series of 4 one-hour webinars. On August 21st, we talked about the scope and nature of the food fraud problem across a number of the most hard-hit food commodity lines. On September 4th, we discussed the means and methods used by perpetrators of food fraud and some of the specific countermeasures we can use to prevent food fraud. If anyone missed any of those presentations, we did record them and we have sent them out to folks to review. Today's webinar builds on the information we presented last time. In this session, we are going to talk in detail about performance criteria and what must be considered in conducting effective food fraud assessments. Our next webinar is on the 25th of September, and we will take the information that has been shared in these learning sessions, 1 through 3, and demonstrate how we can leverage information technology to make the job of curbing food fraud much faster, more effective, and more efficient than the current measures we take. Today's session we will work exactly like the last two. We break up the 1-hour session into 2 blocks of 20 minutes where we give you a presentation dealing with different aspects of food fraud. At the end of each presentation, we stop for 10 minutes to take any questions, comments that the audience has. We consider these discussions to be the meat and potatoes of the webinar because it allows all participants to share information. But because we only have 10 minutes, we need to ask everyone to be pithy in their comments and observations. We will try our best to answer any questions that you have during these 10 minutes. Again, if I could ask people to mute their mics, we're getting some feedback. But because we only do have those 10 minutes, we need to ask everyone to keep their questions concise. You can reach us by blog if we did not answer your questions to your liking, so please feel free to do that. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. John Nacio. John is the Chief Science Officer at FoodQuest TQ. For those who were not part of the last 2 webinars, let me introduce John. Again, John is the Chief Science Officer at FoodQuest TQ. John has extensive experience in risk management, both from the government as well as the industry standpoint. He has worked on fighting fraud and organized crime on everything from nuclear chemicals and biological weapons and materials to food. John's contact information appears here, and if you have any questions after the webinar, John has asked me to tell you to please call. Joe, I think you're here now?
Yes, I am. I'm here.
All right.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, if you wanted to say a quick hello, that's good, and then John will take over.
Yes, well, hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here again as part of the third exercise in this exciting process. Glad you could all join us, and looking very much forward to what this is going to reveal for us, and looking forward with great interest to what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Joe. And good morning, everybody. We're going to start off today. This is the third in a series of 4 webinars on the topic of trying to cut losses from food fraud. Today we're going to spend some significant time talking about what we need to do in order to conduct effective food fraud prevention assessments. Next slide, Bruce. Today we're going to cover 5 things. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a really brief capsule summary of what we shared with you in the first 2 webinars, and we'll try and focus on just the very important elements that we have to carry over into the third webinar. We're going to show you the core elements of the type of program that retailers and their suppliers have to have in place in order to effectively bite into this food fraud problem. We're also going to show you the additional commodity-specific criteria that we've developed across our criteria, and these are basically performance criteria. We're going to talk about suggested responses to the discovery of industrial-scale food fraud. And what I've done at the end of today's presentation is I put together some very, very specific indicators, warnings, and performance criteria as they relate specifically to organized crime. And I'll share those with you. And then the last thing we'll do today is we're going to give you a really short preview of our next interactive learning session, where we will show how information technology might be leveraged to help us do a much better job in fighting food fraud, to simplify everything that we've talked about while providing a very efficient way of dealing with food fraud. Okay, next slide, Bruce. By the end of today's session, we will give you a structure for conducting food fraud assessments that addresses both the criminal enterprise and our good friends, the petty shysters. We're going to talk about what effective performance criteria consist of and how to ask the right questions at the right place and at the right time to actually prevent food fraud. And we're going to do some very interesting, discussions around what standards are and what standards are not in today's environment as it relates to food fraud. Finally, we're going to revisit the criminal enterprise, as I mentioned earlier, and we're going to talk specifically about the performance criteria there. As you recall from the previous webinars, at least anecdotally, we made the case that probably the bigger part of the problem for food fraud, the much bigger part of the problem, is industrial scale criminal enterprise entering the food chain. And so we'll talk some more about that. And the last thing I wanted to leave in your minds as we go through today's session is that the information that we present in webinars 1, 2, and 3 is the basis upon which we're going to discuss how we can leverage information technology next time. So in the back of your minds, keep the notion of using information technology to simplify everything that we've talked about so that it can be done efficiently, easily, and cost-effectively. And hopefully we'll be able to show you more of that the next webinar. Next slide, Bruce. Before we go into the next session, I'm going to quickly summarize, and there's just a couple of slides here, what we did in 1 and 2 that we have to keep in mind as we go into this third webinar. It's kind of like, building a building and we're putting blocks up, and we've got 2 critical blocks that I'd like to talk about for you to keep in mind as I go into the next session. So here's where we are. So far in our series of 2 webinars, we've covered a tremendous amount of territory. We've answered the question, what needs to be protected, why it needs to be protected, what it needs to be protected against, and who needs to protect it and how. You can see the little green checks is all the stuff that we've covered. The targets of food fraud are food companies, regardless of where they are in the production chain, and the unique food commodities they deal with. So we have 3 interdependent variables that have to be considered when you're dealing with food fraud. We answered the question why we need to fight food fraud. It was pretty apparent it's awfully expensive. Some estimates up to $10 to $15 billion a year. The third thing we did, we narrowed down the field of food fraud perpetrators into 2 principal categories. On the one hand, we have the criminal enterprise doing the industrial scale stuff, and we have the petty shyster, who is the person that just takes advantage of opportunity. Fourth, we concluded the job of fighting food fraud is definitely a shared responsibility between the government and industry. But as you recall, we also came to the unfortunate conclusion that industry isn't getting the degree of help it probably could get from governments to help fight this problem. So the burden falls mostly on our shoulders in industry to fight this problem. We talked about extrapolating food fraud countermeasures based on what the perpetrator wants to do and the things he or she must do to accomplish them, the so-called means and methods, or the modus operandi. We talked about how we can place a relative value on the significance of a countermeasure, which is really, really important when you consider the adage, not just asking a bunch of questions, but instead asking the right questions, which is really what we're trying to do with food fraud. Today, we are picking up where we left off in the last session by asking 4 important questions today. First one is, what constitutes an effective food fraud performance criterion? What does it consist of? Number 2, where and how do you apply them to obviously prevent if you can, but respond when necessary to food fraud? Third, how can we develop and use performance criteria to assess and monitor the effectiveness of food fraud programs? And fifth, and certainly not least, is if Murphy's Rule plays out, how do we respond to serious incidents of food fraud? The types of incidents like peanut butter and the Peanut Butter Corporation of America, where you've really got a problem across a really, really big, complex supply system with something like peanut butter or any other major commodity that's seriously tainted. And these are the types of incidents that cost up to, $400 million for $10 billion companies if they get wrapped up in one of these. So it's really, really expensive. Okay, next slide. Now the 2 slides that are the most important to keep in mind as we go through today's session. You remember, at least anecdotally, we were able to put this slide together and we developed it. We showed you how we came to these conclusions in our first webinar. And 2 things to keep in mind here are processors and organized crime. Those are the clusters where we have all the red. Okay, next slide. All right. We also, in the session number 2, we got to the point of talking about how we might begin to quantify countermeasures. Actually apply a number to them so that we can have a relative ranking of value. And this is really, really important considering the fact you could ask thousands and thousands of questions. How do you narrow down the field to identify the questions that you really want to ask? They're really high value and they really make a difference. And it's really important because you can't ask every question you want. We don't have time. The people that are dealing with food fraud are people that work all day. I mean, they're actually doing something, which is try to move a product out to the marketplace. And they, quite frankly, don't have time to focus on food fraud 100% of the time. In fact, probably a lot less than that. So what we have to do is be really, really smart, ask the right questions and only the right questions at the right place and at the right time in order to really make a difference. So, next slide, Bruce. With that, any comments from anyone in the audience about, or questions about the first 2 webinars before I just jump into webinar number 3? Dang, I must be awfully good. No questions. Okay. We'll move on. Okay, now we're going to do part 1 of today's session. This is going to last about 20 minutes. We're going to concentrate on food fraud prevention criteria and address the 4 following questions. 1, we're going to talk about what a performance criteria must consist of and why building in the lessons learned from past experiences where we actually dealt with food fraud, like I did with the fish example the last time, is so important to developing an effective criteria. Second, then we're going to ask some questions about standards, and specifically about the standards that we're currently using to prevent food fraud. And we're going to ask some, pretty tough questions. From here, we're going into the 3 different types of food fraud criteria that you have to have in place for any type of effective food fraud prevention program. So if you're running one of these programs, this will be interesting, and you can be able to kind of say, yeah, we have that or we don't have that. And finally, we're going to show you how we can develop a reduced number of highly focused performance criteria that can more efficiently fight food fraud. Okay. Next slide. Now, as part of our analysis of the existing food defense standards, we looked across 2 global, 7 U.S. federal, and 7 industry standard schemas, and we found over 3,000 food-related performance criteria. That's a lot of criteria. In fact, anybody who is realistically running a business could never deal with 3,000 criteria. It's a simple fact of life. Way, way too many criteria. Dealing with way, way too many different things can create complexity, the likes of which is very, very hard to sift through. Of these 3,000, we identified 1,574 food defense-related criteria mixed in with food safety and other regulatory and best practice food standards. So they're all kind of jumbled all together, and they're in there. And that's, kind of the schemas for today's standards. From these 1,574 food defense-related criteria, I was able to isolate 433 of the requirements that were related in one way or another to food fraud. All of the criteria were directed toward the actions of the petty shyster. We found that organized crime was not addressed by existing standards. Now that's pretty interesting, isn't it? Because in our previous sessions, we anecdotally showed that the #1 problem is organized crime and industrial scale food fraud, and yet we aren't asking the right questions. So I think that is a real telling point coming out of the research that we've done. We've got to do more on organized crime. Now, when I took each of the 433 food fraud related criteria and I subjected each one to a threat continuum analysis, in other words, I provided a value for deterrence, detection, prevention, response, and mitigation using my 1 to 5 Likert scale, what we found out is many of the standards had no or little value. They really didn't address food fraud. There were questions for sure, but when you looked at them from a systems perspective, did they really address food fraud? The answer was pretty much no. And many critical areas were not addressed, and the most important one, of course, is the organized crime question. So then I eliminated the low value requirements, and I filled in the gaps. Okay? Where there were holes, I took our criteria, built criteria that do what I'm going to describe later in the presentation, and we came up with 39 high-value core food fraud prevention criteria that reflect what we call the 5 essential elements of any meaningful food fraud, or for that matter, any performance criteria. So let's go ahead in the next slide and take a look at what those 5 essential elements are, and here they are. The first thing you got to recognize is that each commodity is unique. It's got its own unique food fraud hazards and risks associated with it. And this gets back to the whole discussion we had on means and methods, or modus operandi. The way you're going to commit food fraud with honey is quite different than the way you're going to commit food fraud involving beef. And your criteria have to reflect that. Second, your location on the commodity production chain really matters. It's very, very important. The food fraud challenges facing a cattle farmer, for example, are completely different than those for a transporter or a cold storage facility, a processor, or a retailer. They're just different. Threats vary by food type and your location on the commodity production chain. The perpetrator means and methods vary based on where you are. The countermeasures to prevent food fraud are different based on commodity type, location, on the production chain, and the specific means and methods used by the perpetrator. Last, but certainly not least, the lessons learned from past events to determine what works and what doesn't work is the essential fifth component of any effective performance criterion. Now, when you look across the standards for food safety, food defense, food fraud, anything having to do with our industry and food, we should consider each one of those standards in the context of these 5 elements and ask ourselves realistically, does this criterion consider all 5 of these important issues? And I think the results are a bit surprising when you do that. The bottom line is that the effectiveness of any assessment, audit, or inspection is really the results are based on the quality of the performance criteria themselves. So a really, really important thing for us to think about, and an area where all of us can work together to improve, and I mean dramatically improve, and save money and do all the rest of it, is by looking at the nature of performance criteria. Now, one of the most important elements of that is experience. And Bruce, if you go to the next slide, experience means that you got to go out there and you got to look at food fraud events. You really have to look at them, and you have to scientifically analyze them. You can't, call on the 60-year-old, me, right, the expert, to come in and solve your food fraud problems in a day. It's just not going to work. What you need to do is analyze past events. You really have to get into them and reverse engineer them. Get their structure, date, time, symptomology, all of the data. And what we've done in our case is we've created what we call a POISN. It's called POISN, and it's a metadata repository of these types of events. Okay? What Bruce is going to do in the next couple of minutes, and Bruce, if you could just take a couple of minutes to take him into POISN and just show him an example or two of what we have in there on food fraud, just to show him what we mean.
All righty, John, thanks. Food fraud, POISN is a metadatabase, like John said, and we collect both intentional and accidental poisoning issues. We collect weather-related and environmental issues and equipment malfunctions, but we also do collect information about food fraud. Then once we get that information, we give you a complete description of what occurred during the particular incident that you're interested in. We do provide you with the source information where we got it. We do tell you whether this information was confirmed or not, areas of the world when it was performed. But one other thing we do is to reverse engineer what exactly happened during this particular incident to determine what are the best mitigating factors you can use to prevent, or if something does happen within your facility, to make sure that you control the costs of both consequence and monetary value. So again, we look at it and we reverse engineer it, what actually had to happen for this incident to be successful. We also see here that we start introducing numbers into our system. These numbers come into play later on in our system by what we call a threat quotient. And a threat quotient is the projection out of a negative event occurring within a particular facility. We also look at the critical nodes with regards to where are the best places to be able to counter a particular incident with regards to detection, deterrence, prevention, response, and mitigation. And so we have about 1,500 events in this database right now. As we turn on our crawlers to pull in more and more and more information, that'll make the fidelity of the information much more important and much more precise with regards to, one, identifying issues that have occurred so that we can prevent them in the future. And so, John, I hope we did enough there for them, but if they want more information or if they want a presentation on the POISN tool, we can provide that at a later date and time.
Thanks, Bruce. Now, we just wanted to show you.
Can I just say quickly, sorry. Interestingly, that's something that Lisa and I were speaking about yesterday, in fact, and I know she's listening now. And it's quite difficult to actually get hold of information, to be able to analyse what went wrong in the past, to identify, therefore, what might happen in the future. So, again, I don't know where you get your information from, but certainly getting hold of that information is extremely tricky. So if you've already got a database of that degree of information, that in itself will provide a valuable source of information for investigation. But again, as part of this whole exercise, I'm hoping that I don't have to go away and do that myself, and equally everybody else doesn't have to go and do it on their own, that this is providing a mechanism by which we can actually attack it selectively.
Yeah, you know what's interesting, Joe? There just is out a new food fraud database by the Pharmacopoeia Convention that is a wonderful source for just the basic information. And then what we can do is find sources like that, and then what we do is we put out crawlers against the topical area and pull back the data from any open source that we can find on the World Wide Web. And we've had some luck doing that. We're actually able to, put a sequence together of the event path. And then we're able to look further into information based on that. So there's a wealth of information out there on the World Wide Web if you know what you're looking for. And the key is to be able to narrow it down and harvest the data based on real data that you have in hand first. So we'll be happy to talk with you and Lisa more about that. Okay?
But the
important thing we're trying to get across here in the webinar is the fact that unless you have quantitative data, you do not have a good experiential base upon which you can develop performance criteria. It's that simple.
Absolutely.
So that's the message we're sending loud and clear to everybody, and I think we've done a pretty good job. Now, what happens if you don't do those 5 things? Know what commodity you're working with, know your location on the production chain, know the perpetrator means and methods, extrapolate countermeasures based on those means and methods, and know something about past experience. It's kind of like Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale. We're a bunch of emperors with no clothes. And that does look a bit like my physique at the front there, so I'm a bit embarrassed. Nonetheless, that's what the world is. So what we're trying to do is deal with that basic problem, okay? Now, we have 3 types of food fraud prevention criteria. One is what we call the core food fraud criteria, and that's the criteria that's common to all food operations, regardless of where you are on the production chain, your location. Core food fraud performance criteria are those things that all food operations have to have in place from the very get-go. They are the infrastructure upon which you build your commodity-specific criteria and your production chain-specific criteria. If you don't have the core, you can't do the rest. They are the foundation, or I'm going to use the metaphor of a house here. They're really the basement of the house, if you will, okay? The first story, when you go up the stairs from your core criteria up to the first floor of the house, are the things that relate to the specific means, methods, and countermeasures, and the performance criteria as they relate to a specific food commodity. For example, beef, rice, honey, cocoa. Each one of those have their own specific criteria that's based on how the commodity, where it comes from, number one, and then how it's produced. The second story, so we're going to go up the next flight of stairs, is food fraud commodity-specific performance criteria that relate to the specific segments along that commodity's production chain. So, for example, we have honey. You have a bee grower, right? That's the first element. The second thing you have is extraction of the honey from the web or the core. And then you have a transportation segment because you're moving it to process, and on and on. Very similar to what we already showed you with our fish production chain the last time. Okay? Next one, Bruce. Next slide, Bruce. Okay. Now, if we start off in the basement of our house, it kind of looks like this. And what I'm showing you are the core criteria. These are the things, the 38 things actually, that every company, food operating company, has to have in place before they can even begin the real job of reducing losses. And if you don't have these particular criteria in place, you know, you're kind of the emperor without any clothes. That's basically what it is. You're asking a lot of questions. You've got food fraud losses that are probably staying, you know, pretty consistent and peaking from time to time. If you look at the historical analysis of your losses, it's just kind of a, you know, it's just happening. It's not really being managed. So here what we've tried to do is isolate the very specific food fraud performance criteria as they relate to the petty shyster, the criminal enterprise, and then we've applied a value. You know how we did the 1 through 5 business on deter, detect, prevent, respond, mitigate? That's basically what we did here to come up with how valuable questions around things like statement of corporate intent, which is the first one there. How valuable are those really in preventing a food fraud event based on the food fraud events that we have in our database? And we can tell you it has, you know, just above a median value of 3.5. The response value isn't nearly as high. It's about 3 for a total value of 3.2. Now, if you go down to, let's take a big one. Let's say annual third party, D, under 1, company policies to prevent food fraud. Annual third party good governance audit with a focus on food fraud indicators and warnings, the things we talked about. Well, that's going to help you not against the petty shyster, but it's going to have a big impact with respect to the criminal enterprise. And based on our information, those types of audits, what we call Sarbanes-Oxley audits in the state, can be really, really effective if you require them of your suppliers. And you get a 4.5 prevention value on a scale of 1 to 5. So that tells you, boy, that's one thing you really, really want to do if you're trying to fight industrial scale food fraud. You're going to want one of these good governance audits. Okay? And by the way, most legitimate companies do this once a year anyway. So all you're adding are the criteria that I'll talk about later in the presentation that you want that auditor, that independent auditor looking at the company to ask when they're doing their audit. So it's additive. It's not new. It's additive to what people are already doing, which is really important because it means it's doable. Number 2 is, you know, a critical element, and strength of retail and supplier contracts. If you don't have strong contracts, you are not going to prevent food fraud, and in fact, you're going to invite food fraud based on all of the data that we have in our little database on food fraud. So, what does a good contract look like based on all of these incidents, the ones that worked versus the ones that didn't? First of all, you got 0 tolerance for food fraud. And if the supplier commits food fraud, you ban them from working with you ever again. Number 2, the supplier assumes liability for food fraud. In other words, you know, Ahold, for example, right, or some other major, Aldus, or Tesco, or some major European firm taking the hit, right, a retailer taking the hit on food fraud because of what happened at Comigel, okay? Who should be responsible? Should it be Comigel that's responsible for the cost associated with that problem, or should it be the retailer? Well, I think there's some pretty good evidence because about a week ago, the French went in and they arrested all 5 of the senior leaders of Comigel. They've changed the name of the company to La Scursa or whatever the new name is, and all new management, by the way. and the 5 guys are sitting in jail somewhere right now. Okay? So it's a very, very good example of, why should someone assume the liability that was created at another location on the production supply chain. And of course, the key to all of this is to link in supplier food fraud liability insurance as part of that deal. And then what happens is you have taken a huge, look at these numbers, prevention value cut out of food fraud and industrial scale food fraud in particular. Now, one of the things that we found is very, very effective based on a review of past food fraud incidents is a responsible individual who's actually the person responsible for preventing food fraud at a location. It's not like assigning food fraud to the quality assurance manager at a senior level who is responsible for everything in the corporation from a quality standpoint. No, no, no. This is assigning a single individual who's responsible and accountable for preventing food fraud within the organization. Can make a huge difference in outcomes based on what we've seen. Food fraud awareness programs. And most people, when you think about food fraud awareness, they think, oh, well, it's another training session. I got to go for my hour, I got to sign the sign-in sheet, and I got to do training. No, 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 no. It's much more than that. And number 2 says it all. What you need to do is look at food fraud intelligence, which tells you what the level of risk is internal to your organization as well as the level of risk outside. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. Okay? I'm not going to go through all of these, but these will be available for you to look at online, and you can see what we've done. We've identified what we consider to be the, next slide, Bruce, the 18 categories of interest that you have to think about in any effective core food fraud prevention program, and then the associated area of concern. And you can see here, for example, we get a very high value on organoleptic testing of food ingredients if done properly, and a much higher score for our laboratory testing. So you can see these are the things that you should have as a core food fraud program in place and operating. And if you were to do an effective assessment, you would ask questions around each of these areas of concern. That's where your questions come from. And of course, I've dropped everything in my review that had less than a 2 because I wanted median or higher value. So I eliminated all the what I consider to be low value questions, and now I'm asking just the most important questions based on an analytical review of the numbers. Okay?
Could I just ask you about the laboratory testing?
Yes.
I mean, using HorseGate as an example, everybody's testing like crazy for horse DNA. But I mean, how do you actually set up a laboratory testing regime to detect fraud? Because at the moment, everybody's geared up to testing it for safety and quality. Where would you even begin to go to find out what you need to test it for to counter food fraud?
That's really interesting because what we're doing right now is we're trying to apply HACCP approvals. We're trying to create statistically valid sampling plans where we're looking for pathogens. And we're wasting money and we're wasting huge amount of time. This is the type of testing, Joe, that you do at high-risk areas on the food supply chain. And the only way to identify those is forensically. It's by means and methods. And yet we're trying to find pathogens. There's no rhyme or reason for current testing programs to detect fraud. As you know, there are minimal amounts of equine and porcine allowed in meat and in beef. And so what we end up doing is we go down to such low levels that we're actually detecting stuff that we know is already there. So you need to come up with statistical sampling plans that are based on what the perpetrator is going to do to commit food fraud, not based on our past experience with food safety.
Exactly. Well, that's my dilemma. If I'm going to go away and investigate what testing regime I need to put in for food fraud, I mean, it's well, you just
you actually need to look at the last slide that we're going to show in today's presentation, and then you need, and I'll show you exactly how you develop a statistical sampling plan that's designed to identify industrial scale food fraud. Okay?
Marvelous.
And it ain't HACCP. God love food safety. I love food safety, don't get me wrong, but there's no direct extrapolation from HACCP to the problem of food fraud. I just hate to tell you.
Well, no, well, I think that's worth elaborating on just slightly, in that, yeah, we have a systematic approach for food safety in HACCP, which does not actually help you with food fraud. We've got something systematic for food defence, but what we're lacking is something systematic for food fraud, which is where we're all struggling, and where I believe you can really help.
Now, some people like to jump to the assumption that if I do that for food safety and I follow the HACCP rules, then I'm covering everything under food fraud anyway, and they're not. And that's the dangerous assumption, that one subsumes the other. They don't. So we can talk more about that. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about, you saw some of those core criteria, right? The next thing we're going to talk about is the second four, the commodity-specific criteria. I'm going to use a beef example. I've talked a lot about production chains, but for every commodity, you can break that commodity down into a production chain. And we do it every day. I know, all of us around the table here today know what we're talking about. For example, beef begins at a farm. You take the livestock and you have a transporter take them to slaughter, right? You can either, do your processing in line with slaughter, or you can just slaughter the animal, transmit the carcass to cold storage, let it hang. Another transportation segment takes it to process, where you cut down the beef. Then it goes to cold storage, the product, and then another transportation segment takes it to the product or retailer, store, and sale to consumer. Now, those are the basic steps. You can add, like, there may be 5 transportation segments, or there may be another warehouse at receipt of product, and you can build these out. But this is the basic elements of a beef production chain. And it doesn't change very much. It's always the same. So what you can do now is you can say, okay, at the farm, what's the farmer going to do to commit food fraud? When I transport animals from the farm to slaughter in transportation segment number 1, what are the specific performance criteria that address that? And slaughter, and transportation, cold storage, and through the rest of the process. It really, really gives you a very easy way to construct what you need to do in terms of performance. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you look at what I did with the core criteria, and now you say, okay, I'm going to add to that the commodity-specific criteria, look what happens. I'm able to drive down to the next level, because if I'm a beef farmer, right, I'm growing my cattle, there are only 5 things that, at the end of the process, the retailer has to worry about. Has to worry about unlawful drugs, right? Has to worry about, hey, are the animals being treated fairly? Unhealthy cattle, animal identification or tagging, and a chain of custody certification, that all those other things are correct. And now you have 5 categories of interest at the farm level. Now, in order to address those, we identify the subordinate areas of concern. So, for example, with unlawful drugs, this is one of the reasons we have a veterinarian at every farm, who certifies stuff. It's for these reasons. Oversight and testing of not only unlawful drugs, but amounts of drugs. Oversight and testing for amounts of growth hormones and probiotics. We have legal and illegal probiotics. one involving E. coli, for example, that can significantly impact an animal. So we know that these three things, this isn't petty shyster stuff. You got to be over here to organize how to eliminate or the knowledge of unlawful drugs in your animals. And we don't ask the questions. And we aren't asking the questions of the right people at the right place at the right time right now. And you can see the prevention and the response values are sky high for those questions. So unless you're asking these specific questions of the farmer, you're opening the door to the criminal enterprise coming in, and especially with the growth of large commercial farms today, the type of problem we had in Europe. Okay? Animal cruelty, you can see chain of custody. Now, for example, in transportation, now these are a very manageable number of questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions we ask the farmer. That's all we need to ask the farmer, 7 questions. We don't have to ask the farmer the 433 questions that we're currently asking him. We now have to ask 7. And that's pretty remarkable, your ability to reduce, if you do synthesis and you do effective scientific synthesis, what you can do to make this problem a lot easier to cope with and manage. Transportation, we look at receipt of adulterated product, transport of unhealthy cattle, and counterfeit of shipping documents in that first transportation segment. But I want to point out that after the animal is slaughtered, you got a different set of transportation segment issues. You have basically sales, label, packaging, etc. Okay? Next slide, please. And what you see here, if you go to the next slide, is that we break it the same way all the way down the production chain. And you can see how many of these are related to the criminal enterprise and don't address the petty shyster, which tells you why criminal enterprise is the bigger problem for us. I mean, it's just a fact. Next slide, Bruce. So what we're able to do is this. We've gone through all the commodities up across the top. We've gone through every transportation segment. We know we have 39 questions in the core that people have to answer. And then they need, depending on their commodity type, to answer an additional question. So for example, if I am a transporter of beef, I have 13 questions to answer if I'm a transporter. Okay? If I am a processor, right, I've got 31 questions I have to answer for beef over and above the 39 basic questions that we have. And you can see some commodities are a lot simpler than others, but still very manageable number of questions now. Instead of hundreds of questions, you have tens of questions. Makes a big difference. Next slide, Bruce, please. That's the end of part 1. Do we have any comments or questions?
The only other question, any other comment I've got over and above what I've already said was, I think, again, it's important to reinforce the fact that standards and compliance to standards goes nowhere near food fraud, and there is a big misunderstanding within businesses, within the food sector and enforcement authorities to the contrary that needs to be reinforced. And that going forward, we need to have a whole new set of systematic approach and standards to be able to reflect that. We have been caught out big time, and there's a whole gap that needs filling that this is going to help to fill.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is getting a connect between standards and that experiential base. You know, the thing that you and Lisa are working on, Joe, the database is vital. You've got to be able to quantify events some way and then reflect those in your standards, which is the big hole right now. I know a lot of people are working on this. So, you know, hopefully we'll begin to see some of these gaps filled. Okay, that's it. We're going to move quickly on to part 2. and I'm going to fire hose you in part 2 because of time. I don't want to hold people up too long on time. But please remember that you'll be able to go back. This is recorded, and you'll be able to go back on YouTube, and you'll be able to spend more time looking at the charts that I'm going to flash past you. Okay? So let's go to the next one real fast, Bruce. There are 5 essential food fraud prevention activities that have to go on simultaneously. The first we've already talked about. You've got to use science and risk-based criteria that reflect the 5 things that we talked about. It must be meaningful criteria or you're assessing nothing. You're the emperor with no clothes. The next thing you have to do is you got to conduct assessments. And you've got to do that, by asking only the high-value questions, looking at the balance between prevention and response, continuously monitoring your performance, and the only way you can do all that is through information technology, period. Because supply chains now are so long and so complex, it just would be impossible without using IT. Then, as we discussed in number 2, you got to produce actionable intelligence while you're doing this. You got to know what's going on in your facility. You got to know the information you need to get from outside so that you know that you're asking the right questions. You got to prevent when possible. You're going to deter the bad guy. You're going to detect him. You're going to, communicate an alarm, and you're going to go beat the guy up, basically. You're going to capture him. You're going to put him in handcuffs. And then if he gets away from you, you got to be prepared to respond. And that response depends on what you got to do, the level of the incident. If it's a Peanut Butter Corporation of America thing, you better have a continuity of operations plan, because all the major companies relied on that when they got burned really bad by, Peanut Corporation of America. Next slide, Bruce. Okay, what's the difference between an effective food fraud assessment and one that isn't? Pretty simple. It's very simple. And there they are. I don't need to go through them. Anybody who's been in the food industry knows exactly what we're talking about here. So these are kind of the very, very basic elements. And, something that produces nothing is something that really bothers me, because we're spending a lot of money using performance criteria that may not be applicable, resulting in, what we got. So you've seen all that. Next one, producing actionable intelligence. You have a number of things that you do strategically, and we have a number of things that we have to do tactically. And you got to do both of these. And what we'll talk about next time is some ways to use information technology to do that. Next one, Bruce. Now, prevent when possible. What we use is a systems example. This allows me to, apply algorithms and do some stuff to tell us how well we're performing. And what you got to do is you obviously have to discourage the bad guy. You have to, detect him, discover him. You got to stop. The minute you detect it, you got to stop any adulterated food from getting into the food supply. This is what you do, if you're at a production facility and you find out that the food is, something is wrong with it, you put a stop on any shipment. Then you sound an alert, right? And then you get to the bad guy fast enough to put handcuffs on him. And then if he gets past you, you got to respond effectively. And you got to respond in a way that you really can stop him. So if you send a 75-year-old night watchman, right, to catch somebody who's trying to steal one of your trucks, chances are you're not going to stop them, okay? You've got to respond effectively. Next slide. Now, Murphy's Rule plays out and something happens. You got 3 things you got to do according to the systems process. You got to stop any more adulterated food from getting into the food supply. You got to recall what's out there. And last but not least, you have to, depending on the level of the emergency, how big it is, do 3 things. Risk communications plan, obviously for brand name, insurance, and continuity of operations. So now what we have is a complete, what we call threat continuum all the way through, that we can now build algorithms to look at past events and see where we need to beef stuff up, that no pun intended, to strengthen the system. Next slide, Bruce. Okay, guess what? We're right here. We have now completed all the way through what we needed to cover in order to get to next week's presentation on what we've done with information technology to address all of these things. Okay? So now, we're really smart about food fraud. Yay! Now, we covered a lot of territory here. This is, very, very good that you were able to sit down and actually listen to all of this. It's very difficult because it is, kind of a mental exercise. Next slide, Bruce. Now, before I let you go today, I'm going to talk about one last slide. And this is the multi-billion-dollar slide. I sound like Carl Sagan. Billions and billions of stars, except it's billions and billions of dollars. Next slide, Bruce. And it's hard to read, but it's a very important slide because what I've laid out here are the things, the specific things that you must do if you're going to ferret out industrial scale food fraud. And they're relatively simple things. If you look in that last column, that gives you the criteria. In other words, those are the questions you need to ask. Those are the specific questions that if you ask, you're going to take a huge, huge bite out of industrial scale food fraud. So, for example, we've already talked about countermeasures based on multiple performance criteria. And we talked about the 5 things that they got to have, right? If you ask a shell company, you want proof of registration. You want a record of past performance. You need a personnel security program with real background checks for every corporate official, because they're the ones that are involved in organized crime. You're going to conduct that good governance audit that we talked about. You're going to have a food fraud awareness and rewards program. In other words, the employees at Comego, had they come forward to the authorities and said, hey, they're putting horse meat in the beef, then that person should have been rewarded for coming forward. As in a highly, highly effective way to fight organized crime. And you remember my fish story, the one I told, at the last one? That where one person turned in another, they basically ratted on each other. That's a very powerful mechanism when you're dealing with folks like this. You need proof of registration, because what they're doing is they're forming coalitions. Remember the fish guy who got to the other fish distributors? You look at these things and you're going to catch them every time. If you launder money, you need to look at illicit banking relationships, offshore banks, indicators and warnings as part of your good governance audit. And then you need to do cash flow process maps as part of your yearly audit. And then good governance audit. So you can see the very, very specific things that you need to counter. The means, methods, and countermeasures are in this last column. So when you get a chance, just sit through that and think through the logic of that, and you will realize very quickly that's a very, very good set of anti-industrial scale food fraud questions. And all of these criteria are going to be built in to the technology tool that we show you the next time. That's it, Bruce. Any questions, anybody?
I'm interested to know.
Oh,
sorry.
Go for it, Lisa.
I'm interested to know how many companies you think actually have something like this in place, and whether you've got any empirical evidence of these sort of criteria being used, the core criteria and others that you've come down to.
We know, Lisa, to answer your question, we really, really understand the core criteria very well.
Mm.
And the core criteria are really drawn from schemas that are already in place.
Yep.
So
okay.
we know that, certification bodies are using AIB, BRC, all of the standards out there.
Yeah,
So the real question is, do the standards address food fraud? Were they developed to address food fraud? And my guess would be no, they weren't. And I think HorseGate is probably the very best example or demonstration of the fact that that's not what they were created to deal with.
No, but even so, if you get it down, I mean, how much is actually done in practice? I mean, the standards may be wrong, but have you got any evidence of what companies are doing in practice?
Just based experiential and anecdotal, because generally the industry does not share their detailed assessment results with much of anybody. And that's where I would have to go to get that data. And it's proprietary. I can understand why companies keep that type of sensitive information proprietary.
Yeah.
And, you know, the other thing is, you know, fraud is a lot like rape. It's underreported. And because if you report bad food fraud in your organization, you're going to start badly affecting your brand name.
Absolutely.
It's a tough problem.
Yeah. I mean, it's ticking all the boxes that Lisa and I were sort of looking at yesterday. Actually today, as a consequence of that meeting, I was looking at some business risk reports, and there was one report, I think it was Ernst & Young or somebody like that, was saying that they'd done a review of business fraud prevention, and there was, I think the statistics were something in the order of 64% of businesses hadn't even gone in anywhere near any kind of fraud mitigation protection to cover the core questions that you've just identified, and that was in a global business risk report, not just food, and I would suggest that possibly food is even a worse case than that.
What we do find out, and when we look at what are called in the States, the Securities and Exchange Commission requires a 15K. It's a document that talks about risk for publicly held companies. And frequently you'll see, you know, risk management is given lip service in that. But you can't get Lisa down to the point of understanding what they're really doing about it. But I would suspect, based on these $10 to $15 billion a year guesses, probably not a lot, or probably not as much as they need to, and it varies by company. I mean, I'm sure that there are some companies out there working really, really hard on food fraud.
Yeah, I can see a research project somewhere.
Yeah, I think you could do it. It would be great to have that data. It would be absolutely great to have that data. Surveys may be an effective way, a blinded survey to bring in that data, which would be a great idea.
Yeah, I don't do many surveys myself, but I have colleagues in the States who do. I might be talking to them.
Yeah, I would love to work with you on something like that to, you know, talk about what we've done here to make sure we can get some really meaningful questions in there and see what we got. So next week what we're going to do is we're going to take all of this complex stuff and we're going to try and show you how you can apply information technology to make the job of doing everything that we've discussed in the first, you know, 3 webinars very easy to do, very, very efficient to do, more efficient than the current methods, and more effective than the current methods. So that's what our objective is for food fraud, is to make it easy, fast, and effective. And we'll do that next week.
Look forward to it.
Okay, any more questions? Any more? Going once. Going.
I was going to say one more. I'll take you on the 2. I've been looking at this in more detail with other colleagues, including Lisa. And one of the things that we couldn't quite build into a sort of systematic approach was the fact that you've actually got people involved in organised crime that actually have legitimate food businesses as a front to their criminal activities. How would you build that into what you've already got, or is that already in there and I couldn't quite see it?
It's already in there. And it's in the last chart. You're looking at shell companies. And what you want to do is you want to look at cash flow process maps as part of your good governance audit.
Okay.
That's the #1 indicator that you're dealing with shady characters.
Mm-hmm.
And then you tie that in. You can another indicator, not as important, are the where they do their banking.
Well, the double irony of those situations from the examples that I've been given is that the standard of the factories is absolutely superb, because the criminals don't actually care how much money they invest in a factory. So you're in a dangerous situation, because you've actually got something that's absolutely fabulous, but it's actually too good to be true. And so then it was interesting.
True, and that's
in the works.
Based on illicit funds, which is the money laundering, and that's why you need those process flow maps. The answer is always their motivation is to make money, so you follow the money. And it's like traceability. You got to go up and you got to go down. So when they're investing $15 billion in this new facility, the first question you ask is, where did they get that money? And that's done in the good governance audit. That's an indicator and warning of organized crime infiltration in the company. And that's what you call in the independent auditor to look at for you. But they do it every year. In the States, companies that are publicly held anyway have to do that once a year. So you ask the right question during that good governance audit to ferret out whether or not they're using shell companies for the purpose of acquiring, and they also use acquisitions as well, Joe.
Yeah, but what's also an interesting discovery in my own personal journey is that it requires a completely different mindset. I'm geared up to compliance and safety and doing it right. To try and shift your mindset completely into a different direction is not as easy as it might appear.
Right, and you're dealing with principally human behavior here, and a limited number of ways to do things. And if you can bring those together, if you can kind of integrate the subjective human behavior with the quantitative scientific reality of things, you can manage it. But unless you do that, you're never going to manage the problem.
No. It's all fascinating.
Okay?
Alrighty. Well, next Wednesday, we're going to be showing you how we take all that we've done in the first 3 webinars and put it into a intelligent platform that we do call Food Fraudster. So we look forward to showing you that, and please join us again next week. And thank you all so very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.